Welcome to the Daily Path. I'm Nick Robinson.
And I'm Elaina Robinson.
Thank you all for joining us. We are done, I think, with this mini-series on baptism. We've gone through a wide range of stories, and we're back to a narrative story. Mm-hmm. But we're reading it out of the book of Mark. In the other Gospels, you get longer stories. You get more details. More happens in Mark chapter 1 than in multiple chapters of some of the other Gospels. It's just quick hitting, fast paced, boom, boom, boom. This happens, this happens, this happens. Mm-hmm. And Mark skips things like the birth of Jesus. We don't know where he comes from. He shows up and then he's baptized. And there's what happens at his baptism, Elaina? There's a voice from heaven, and what does it say?
God says, "You are my son, whom I dearly love. In you I find happiness."
Yeah, and so here, like the main idea here of what's happening is Jesus has shown up. John, his relative, has been out in the wilderness baptizing people, calling them to change their hearts and their lives. Jesus comes out to be baptized. And in some of the Gospels, John says things like, "Oh no, I'm not fit to baptize you. You should be baptizing me." Or there's all this buildup like, "Oh, I've told you that someone greater than me is coming, and here he is." There's some places where it seems like John knows Jesus. There's a few places where it seems like John doesn't know Jesus, and kind of all these tensions in that. But they all have this experience of where the Spirit, like heaven splits open, the sky split open, a dove, maybe like something that looks like a bird. I always picture it like a giant shining light kind of dove descending on Jesus and kind of like wrapping him and like blending into him. I don't know why I picture that, but that's what I've always pictured. So the dove comes down as Jesus is like coming up out of the water, and then God speaks audibly. And I think it's always when I've read it, I've taken this as an audible voice that's been heard by not just Jesus, but also the other people around him.
Yeah.
That there's this voice that can be heard. What do you think it would be like hearing that from God? "You are my child, whom I dearly love. In you I find happiness."
Like how comforting. And how, it would be like getting a warm hug from your earthly parents,
Yeah.
Or like I think of hugging our children. It's just what a pure statement of love and simple, but meaningful.
Well, I think it might be like the ultimate form of positive reinforcement.
Yeah.
Like when our parents or our bosses or our peers tell us, "I'm proud of you. You're doing a good job. You nailed that." Like that fills us with good feelings and makes us want to keep going. And like, this is super positive reinforcement. "You are my son, whom I dearly love. In you I find happiness." Now, this is true about Jesus. And in a different way, I think it's true about us.
Yeah.
When God sees us, I think he sees us as his children.
Yeah.
Whom he dearly loves and finds happiness in us. I don't think that's exclusive to Jesus. Now, I don't think any of us should expect an audible voice to tell us that.
No.
No? Have you heard an audible voice say that to you?
No.
No, okay, me neither. Well, I was prepared to be surprised here. I have never had that. I've had feelings of affirmations from God sometimes.
Yeah.
But never this specific thing. You made an interesting observation as we were talking about this before we started recording.
Yeah.
And what was it?
Well, so, God says, "You are my son, whom I dearly love, and you I find happiness." But then the next sentence is, "At once, the Spirit forced Jesus out into the wilderness, and he was tempted by Satan, and among wild animals, the angels took care of him." But at once, like that makes me think it was like, hey, the dove came down, God said this, Jesus walked out of the water and went straight into the wilderness, which is not what you would expect to happen when you've heard this audible voice from God saying that he finds happiness in you, and then he's going to send you into this wilderness to be tempted and be among wild animals that can harm you.
I'm picturing him running Forrest Gump like out of the river
Oh.
into the wilderness now, like beard growing longer by the day.
Yeah. I mean, 40 days.
Yeah,
That's a
not
long
giving
time.
up. And it's this interesting juxtaposition to me of this warm fuzzy feeling and then hardship.
Yeah.
And it, even for Jesus, being close to God, God's son, following God, being fully divine himself, was not protection against hardship. Which we know because we've heard about things like the cross and his death, the betrayal of his friends and the desertion from his friends. So it's not surprising to us, but here it's back to back. And even though we know Jesus suffered, I think a lot of the times maybe I get resentful when I do suffer. Like, shouldn't this be easier, God? I'm trying to do what you're telling me to do. I'm sorry if I'm messing up. If you could be clearer, though, I'd be glad to do it better.
Yeah. Where's the audible voice now,
Yeah.
God? I could really use it right now. Yeah. I don't, it's interesting because even though this beautiful moment happened, life isn't always beautiful, right? There is hardship, there's hard times, and there's no explanation. I mean, this is the Spirit forced Jesus out there. So, I mean, it wasn't Jesus's choice. I mean,
What do you think the Spirit's motivation was?
I can't even begin to.
Yeah. I did, like, people talk about God's refining fire and preparing us for certain kinds of things. And I wonder, and the wilderness is often a place of spiritual awakening and deep spiritual experiences. And so Jesus has this warm, fuzzy riverside mountaintop experience of spirituality.
Yeah.
I wonder how meaningful the wilderness experience was to him as well. Like, if that was just as meaningful, those 40 days of hardship, maybe he found just as much meaning there as he did in his baptism.
Yeah. Well, I mean, thinking back to, my past and the times that I've struggled, quite honestly, the times that I have struggled the most are the times that I felt closest to God. And sometimes I find when I'm happy in my personal life and I don't have those struggles, I don't have to cling to God as much, so I don't feel as close to him. So that could be,
So we should all seek hardship as often as possible.
No, I do not recommend it.
This Sunday, we're going to talk about remembering our baptism. I wonder what Jesus remembers from this. Like, if this becomes a propelling moment, a moment that he can lean on at the other hard moments of his ministry, or even in the wilderness, if he was leaning on his baptism in the wilderness.
Carry him through the wilderness.
No.
I mean, that one moment, was it enough to help him get through? And gosh, if it was, I wish and I pray that I could have that focus. I mean, there's a lot of things that are thrown at us here on earth that can distract us. And that's, I feel like, a struggle I have often too, is pushing those distractions aside.
And there's a certain chronology to faith, like in our personal lives. We experience God, then we say yes to God. And to me, this reminds me that, like, saying yes to God is the first step. And when you say yes to God, God is going to take you on a journey. Like, you're going to be growing in ways that, even if you're comfortably in your own home and have not changed your life at all, you're going to be forced to grow in certain kinds of ways through saying yes to God that will be uncomfortable on their own, even if you're surrounded by comfort in other ways.
Yeah.
And you're going to be asked to do things that make you uncomfortable. So, like, I used to hate speaking in public.
What?
I know. Like, just like everyone else.
Yeah.
Like,
And now you do it every week.
and I'm on a podcast every day.
Every day.
Like, I'm just always talking and expecting people to listen to me. Tell me about it. You're saying. But there was a hardship and a growing in learning to be in front of people on a regular basis, and, like, sometimes sounding like an idiot and being okay with it. Like, not beating yourself up over it, but, like, not getting too high or too low, But there was a long period, much longer than 40 days and 40 nights of growing as a preacher. My first sermon at my second church that I shared with the congregation, some people who ended up becoming my friends counted all of the ums that I said, and they snickered, and I'm sure I still have a lot of tics in my preaching where I say some of the same things and the same phrases over and over again. But I've come a long way since that first Sunday in Fort Wayne and the first Sunday in English, Indiana, a year or so before that.
Yeah.
And so the wilderness, like, even if it's not a wilderness that we've been sent into, like a season of growth and change, whether it's in our whole lives or an area of our life, can feel like wilderness and hardship.
Definitely.
So there's kind of one factor in the wilderness that sounds kind of nice. Do you know what I'm referring to? Someone took care of Jesus.
The angels?
The angels took.
Yeah.
So even in the wilderness, Jesus was not sent out alone.
Right. He was not alone.
God was still there with him through the presence of the angels. There was still support, spiritual support, and carrying him that we shouldn't take lightly. We shouldn't write it off. I think I often write it off because I have no idea what it means for the angels to take care of him. Like, I have no idea what that means.
Yeah. In what ways did they take care of him?
Yeah, because he talks about fasting in the wilderness, and being. This one actually doesn't. Mark doesn't talk about fasting, but in the other Gospels we see it. And well, were they giving him food? Well,
was it moral support?
Yeah, you can do it. You can do it.
Oh.
Yeah, I don't know, but I think for me that reminds me that in my wilderness, to look for those supports, to look for the church, or to look for God, or to look for resources that are going to help me instead of trying to rely on all of my own strength.
Gosh, this is all just hitting home for me. Like, these last couple of days talking on the podcast of, oh, we can't do it all. We shouldn't have to do it all. And I think these angels could be, other parts of the body of Christ, right? Like, we don't have to look very far.
Yeah, it could be other people. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, why don't we wrap up our podcast for today? I hope you listened to the sermon that's going to be given today. You can catch it online or in person at Asbury at 1751 27th Street in Columbus, Indiana, or on our YouTube page at youtube.com/@theasburycolumbus.
That's a mouthful.
It is kind of a mouthful. You get there once and your computer will remember it. You're probably listening to this podcast there. That's where most of our listens come from. But I hope to see you either online or in person. Let's close in prayer. God, we thank you so much for the gift of our baptism. Help us to remember what it means in our lives. Help us to know that when we have these high spiritual moments, that spiritual hardship can follow too. Help us to find the gift in both of those places, in the hardship and in the joy. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you for joining us on The Daily Path. I'm Nick Robinson.
And I'm Elaina Robinson.
See you next time.